Hi, everyone. Today I want to speak about the translation movement. What is the translation movement? It is a moment, actually not just a moment, but a century or two, in which Greek sciences and Latin sciences were translated into Arabic, usually via Syriac, and developed in turn the philosophical and scientific tradition, partially in the Islamic world. Now, just a bit of background. You can remember that the Umayyad Caliphate, which was the first kind of dynasty after the initial years of Islam, kind of between 650 to 750, stretched all the way to Spain and then into Central Asia and now Pakistan. But really, the period we're talking about is mostly the Abbasids, which followed afterwards, at this point, just kind of North Africa to Central Asia. And the interesting thing, though, is that the most productive golden period or classical age of Islamic thought and thinking, especially in terms of philosophy, is actually not during the height of the Abbasids when everything was unified, but afterwards, from kind of 900 to 1100. It was there when you have multiple courts, multiple dynasties vying for prestige, that you have enough competition to support, let's say, an economy of scholarly production, which pushed people to write and integrate more interesting things. But it all started to some degree with the translations that were occurring in the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, of course, even after 900, even after 1000, 1100, there continue to be many interesting, important works of philosophy. But what we're talking about here is a period in which we have a moment of cultural fluorescence, basically a moment of civilizational formation. You can also think of this as canon formation. It's a moment in which there is an Islamic culture being crafted, which would ultimately unite not just Muslims, but also anyone who was living in the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, and anywhere that kind of Islamic civilization spread, regardless of people's religion. So just again, the translation movement was an extended moment, really done at 750, 950, high point around 800, 850, translating scientific and philosophical texts from Syriac, Greek, and Persian into Arabic. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this is part of the development of, as I pointed out, a sort of Islamic civilization, meaning a set of works and ideas and authors and so forth that served as the ground stone, I don't know if that's even a word, but the touchstone for every future work, even if it wasn't directly related. They served as authorities that continued to be relevant to readers and writers and people in general, just like we think of Newton today as kind of the founder of modern physics in many ways, rather than, I don't know, Aristotle or something like that. This is a moment in which we have a new canon, a new civilization kind of being fleshed out. And this is one of the interesting things that Michael Cook brings up is, why is it that in this case, the Arabs and the young Muslim community didn't just assimilate into a larger kind of civilizational or cultural canon that was around, that of the Persians or that of the Byzantine Christians, that of the Romans, essentially, and instead ultimately founded a new one. And a lot of it was actually based on older Persian and Roman models. As we'll see, is that process of translation that ultimately made it their own and made it something new as people built upon this and wrote new works of science and thought. So one thing to think about, is Islamic science just science that Muslims do? How would you actually, what makes Islamic science Islamic? Is it just when people do science with some sort of religious motivation? They're basing themselves maybe off of the Quran or the Hadith? Or is it just because when Muslims do science, it becomes Islamic science? And if that's the case, well, what do we make about Christians or Jews conducting science in the pre-modern Middle East? do they also take part in Islamic science or not? One thing to think about here is the idea that, again, that this is not just something that's tied to a religion, but it's a larger civilization, a set of cultural touch points and authorities and books and ideas that were relevant to everyone. They were relevant to people of all religions in the medieval Middle East and the medieval Mediterranean, and continued to be so until about 1800, 1850, when a new version came about, that of Europe. And there was also kind of a new transformation after the Mongol conquests in 1250. But this is something that appealed to everyone, and everyone took part of it. And if we look at the work of rabbis, Jewish poets in Spain, they're also talking about the same ideas, the same things. And in fact, also Christians in medieval Europe were also pulling on Arabic philosophers and ideas, because they knew that this was the space of culture, of civilizational transformation that was much higher than whatever it is that they had in Paris or in Germany or whatever in the year 1000. One thing to keep in mind is, why don't we use the idea of Arabic science? Here too, we have the problem of, well, what exactly is an Arab back then? Is it just someone who spoke Arabic? Is it someone who identifies as ethnically Arab? Probably, let's say around the year 1000 or 900, people who spoke Arabic might not identify as Arabs. In fact, the word Arab was probably used predominantly for nomadic Arabs, the types that emerged from Arabia around the year 630 and initiated the conquests, so created this place. But they might give local identities, etc. They wouldn't call themselves Arab. And in fact, as we'll see, a lot of the work that was being done by people who didn't necessarily speak Arabic. In that sense, we sometimes use the word Islamic in its place, or better yet, something called Islamicate, which talks about the larger cultural civilization attached to the Islamic world. So how are we going to define Islamic science? I'm going to define it as a canon of texts, practices, and ideas that were often written in Arabic. And Arabic here is important because it became the language of culture. Somewhat surprisingly, it became the language not only of administration, but of everyday life for many people, and ultimately for intellectual pursuits as well. And this Islamic science began around the year in the 800s. Now, as I pointed out, you find it in the Islamic world, but it traveled very far to all sorts of parts, to medieval Europe, but also to South Asia. In fact, the canon of Islamic medicine, which came to be known as Unani or Greek medicine, was there. Everyone was taking part in this, or could take part indirectly or directly in this vision of Islamic science. Now, just some terminology. In Arabic, we call the sciences, ilm, one science, ilm, multiple sciences, ulum. So for example, ilm al-hadith is the science of hadith. Ilm al-najum is the science of the stars, here meaning astrology, different from astronomy, which is ilm al-hayat, al-haya. So we have here the word that they use for science, but their vision of science is different from ours, and in fact is much closer probably to what anyone prior to 1850 or 1900 would use for the idea of science, just like some systematic form of knowledge. So you could have a science of hadith because there was a way of systematizing knowledge about hadith. It didn't have to do with the natural sciences, it didn't have to do with math necessarily, though they did have an idea that there was something called natural sciences based off of the Greek vision of it. Someone who does the sciences is a scholar, is called an alim. Remember the three-letter roots here are the same, this apostrophe, lam, mim. And the plural of alim is ulama. These are just words that you should keep in mind because they're used pretty often. Now, I want to start the story in 832 with the Caliph al-Ma'mun trying to open up the period of Khufu outside of Cairo. Back then, there wasn't a Cairo. There was a garrison city called Fustat, a bit south, now part of modern Cairo, but it was a bit south of what would become Cairo. And further out afield, relatively close by, is Giza, which has the pyramids. And the Caliph Al-Ma'mun, and if you remember him, he had fought a long civil war with his brother Al-Amin for control of the Abbasid Empire. He won at a certain point, and now he's at different points touring the empire and for different reasons. So he is in Egypt, and he decides to figure out what is in the pyramid of Khufu. So it was known that the ancients had knowledge, and in this case, they understood that hieroglyphics, even if they couldn't read them, conveyed some sort of knowledge of the ancients. The idea, of course, is that if you could tap into the knowledge of the ancients, you could therefore gain the wisdom which would help you in this world technologically. So it's a bit different from our vision, right? Which we don't think of the past as providing a font of knowledge that we were trying to tap into. In fact, just the opposite. We're constantly trying to overthrow what was written before to look beyond anything older than 20 or 30 years. So in this case, you try to get towards better knowledge by getting towards the closest origin, the purest form of science, which is often the most ancient, possessed by ancient peoples. So this is one reason why he was interested in going to the pyramid. And you can actually read about how he explored the pyramid, or rather he had the pyramid explored by other people. There's a description of what they did. So inside the pyramid were passages leading up and others leading down, all of them terrifying in appearance and difficult to get through. These passages led up to a cubicle room, 8 by 8 cubits in size. In the middle of the room was a basin made of marble. When the top was broken off, nothing was found inside but decayed human remains. At that point, the caliph put an end to the expedition. So we can see here in number B, we can see the actual tunnel that he had dug through the pyramid and Mamun, in which he entered, eventually hit the passageways, right? So there's 2 passageways and there's multiple antechambers and fake ones, etc., to deter grave robbers. One goes to eventually a subterranean chamber, and one goes to the king's chamber. And it seems that they basically entered, they had the one going down and one going up. Eventually, they entered the king's chamber, opened up the sarcophagus, what we know known as a sarcophagus, and found a mummy. Not finding anything of particular interest, which is probably what they wanted with books or something, some sort of pure discussion of ancient knowledge, they abandoned the project. But it shows that Al-Ma'mun was probably the most intellectual of all the caliphs, of the Abbasid caliphs, was interested in trying to recuperate or at least seize ancient knowledge. Ultimately, it wasn't until 1799 when this stone, the Rosetta Stone, was found. The Rosetta Stone has hieroglyphics, Demotic Greek, and I think Syriac with ancient Greek. That's 2 forms of Greek on it. I zoom in, maybe Coptic, and with that knowledge, because one of those could be read, and I think also the Coptic, they could finally decipher the hieroglyphics, and with it started this academic study of hieroglyphics, etc. They didn't have access to this rock, but they were interested in translation. They were interested in trying to crack the code of ancient knowledge. And so under Al-Ma'mun, we have the translation movement goes into high intensity. And there was a concerted push to translate lots of texts from Greek, from Syriac to Persian, and Sanskrit into Arabic. Most of them were in Greek and Syriac. A lot of them was but also Persian, lesser degree Sanskrit. So there's 3 major areas that they focused on: for astrology, geometry / math, and third, dialectics, logic, and metaphysics. So why were they so interested in this? Who commissioned these translations? What's going on here? Well, to begin with, we have to start off with even something more basic, which we don't think about as a development, but it is important. It's the introduction of paper. So if you were to pick up a piece of paper like this, you might not think of anything of it, but it's actually a pretty cool form of technology, because before, people were using either animal skins, that is parchment. So every time you needed to write a book, you basically had to kill 50, baby goats or baby sheep, process those skins to tear off the flesh, and then basically have them around. Parchment is very resistant. It lasts a long time. You can erase the previous lines and write over them, but it's very, very expensive. You can imagine how much it would cost to kill, 50 to 100 goats today. It was even more expensive back then when animals were not industrially farmed, and it was something that was very difficult to obtain. The other option was papyrus. Papyrus was, okay, it was written, it was relatively functional, but it was made mostly in Egypt, and it wasn't as resistant. It tended to break apart. Now, all of a sudden comes from Samarkand, a new form of technology, basically adapting Chinese techniques of making a type of paper from, instead of using basically the inner bark of certain trees, to use basically linen rags. They took rags, they mashed them up, macerated them for a very long time, and then they would dip those rags into, they would dip like a reed form into that mush of rags, and then pull it out, and then they would dry it and then hang it up, and then it would be processed further. Now, this rag paper, which is different from the paper we have today, if you pick up a piece of paper today, it's made out of wood pulp. This is a new industrial process made in the 19th century. This rag paper was reliable. It was much cheaper than parchment. It could be made anywhere. You didn't necessarily have to be in Egypt to get papyrus. And it lasted a long time. And in fact, it's much better than basically any other record-keeping technique we have. Imagine today, for example, hard drives, SSD hard drives, have a lifespan of probably 20 to 30 years, at which point they start breaking apart. The same thing with CDs, discs, anything like that. Paper, if kept properly and kept away from fire, does not decay. You can keep it for a very long time. And in fact, if you look at old paper from, books from the 1500s, 1400s, it looks almost new. The modern industrial paper, because it's been treated with acid, starts to yellow and get brittle, etc. But the paper that they were making was very good. And there was different qualities, of course. There was stuff used for writing, but there was also stuff used for industrial. Funnily enough, Europeans knew about paper, but they didn't adapt it. They were suspicious, or for whatever reason, they didn't want to take it up. And it was only after possibly the Crusades that they ended up adopting paper more heavily, after which they became the predominant producers of paper for the Islamic world and for the European world. Now, what did paper allow to happen? One is allowed writing to become much cheaper and much easier and much more quickly accessible. And that allowed for people to kind of write books much more quickly. And if you remember, one of the things we were talking about is the transformation of the book into the codex before, let's say 700, 800, or right around that time. Books weren't in the form of the book that you would know today, something like this. They were instead basically scrolls, or on occasion tablets or things like that. But to have a book with a cover that you can flip through, move around the different parts, this was, in some ways a revolutionary transformation of accessibility. And there was now a culture centered around courts that was very rich, that was fueling the development of learned culture, intellectual culture, literary culture, etc. And now there was a new form of writing medium that could support it, which was rag paper. So this led to basically a flood of books in some ways. So this is a description of the library in Shiraz in the 900s of a local ruler. He said, "There's a manager, a librarian, and a supervisor from among the people of good repute in the town. There was not a book written up to that time of all the various sciences, but happened to be there. It consists of a long oblong gallery and a large hall with rooms on every side. He attached to all the walls of the gallery and rooms bookcases 6 feet in height and 3 cubits long, made of wood and decorated. For every subject, there are bookcases and catalogs, which are the name of the books." And in fact, there were so many books. This figure, Ibn al-Nadim, wrote a work called the Fihris, the Index, which is just a gigantic bibliography of many of the books that he knew about, but doesn't come close to representing most of the stuff around there. And he had 10,000 books at the time by over 2,000 authors. The other thing that shifted is that at the time, there was a greater emphasis initially, especially in the 600s, 700s, greater emphasis on oral transmission. So if you remember, initially the Quran, the Hadith, they were transmitted person to person. And in fact, the first Hadith collectors just went around memorizing Hadith that they would collect and then eventually write them down on notes and then turn them into books. But this trust in books, trust in the written word, took a long time to develop, especially among the Hadith men who really prioritized oral recension. And that's because they believe that, knowledge, kind of like today, is not about the institution you come from. Your authority is not about where your degree is or where you work, but it's about your relationships with other people, right? And so you always should learn from someone who's well-known, well-respected, pious, and has a good reputation for knowledge. And it's that relationship between a teacher and a student that validates the information from the student. If you were to take one of my classes, no one cares that you studied with Nir Shafir. Instead, they care that you have a degree from the University of California. So very different from our system today. One of the things that happens is that there's a greater emphasis on this period, 600s to 800s, and continuing onwards very much so for a very long time, right until the 1500s, but decreasing over time, is that there's an decreasing emphasis on memorization, right? So you would go to school, which at this point there was no formal schools, but you would go to a study circle in a mosque or somewhere. You would memorize the text and then discuss it. So memorization was always the first step. Then you would recite it. And then there would be a face-to-face discussion about it. It would be commentaries, back and forth information about the text and how to think about it. So this is a very oral culture initially. And with the initially books started coming into this and basically being like aide memoire, like study aids. They're basically places to scribble down notes, things like that. They were used as reference works, but not like something you would pick up and just read on your own to get information in the same way you would with a book today. The book was just a helper to remind you of the information you learned on a one-on-one transmission session. And in fact, there was even something called transmission certificates called an ijaza, which basically said, so-and-so studied this book with me, and he's allowed to pass it on, right? So it's the connection between the teacher and the student that validates that knowledge. And then you have something like reading certificates where just sometimes people would publish books and then they would debut them, and then they would list everyone who was there at the debut. They would list all the major scholars, but also some of the artisans who would come, the wives, the concubines, children, etc., who were also present at these reading circles. Now, what this meant is that reading was really social, right? Learning was about being the interpersonal contact between people. And so this kind of idea we have of reading, which is like you curl up with a book and you read, or you're studying individually by yourself, that was kind of frowned upon. That individual reading, it was called mutala, reading with the eyes. It was something that was limited basically to either very major scholars who had the capacity to do it, if you're very well respected, or it was limited to certain genres, things like fiction, poetry, things that you would read for fun, but not for stuff that you had to study that was meant to be tied to religion or law, etc. Now, just an aside, throughout this time, basically books are all copied by hand, right? So there's a fluorescence of books after the adoption of rag paper, and it just kind of keeps going, but they just kept copying everything by hand. Over time, the Europeans did invent print in the 1400s. In 1500s, 1600s, print really took off. But they knew about print. People in the Middle East knew about print. There was even some attempts to make printed books, but it never really was widely adopted. Why is that? It's not, as people claim, that they were afraid of European technology, or they were against modernity or any of this stuff. Ultimately, it's just that printing is very expensive. And it just didn't make financial sense at that time to print books. Manuscripts, even though they took more work to make, were kind of made to order pieces that simply worked better and were more flexible for the period at the time. Eventually, print was adopted around the 1850s, but only after massive government investment. So I'm going to stop here for a second, and we're going to continue this in another part